All right. Welcome to this is our Instagram channel. So happy to have you here. Will you tell us a little bit about your work?
Sure. So I'm Kylie, and I'm a pediatric occupational therapist here in Canada. Over the last, I guess, 8 years, have really dived into niching down to the 0 to 2 population, and supporting infant development, infant sleep, which then led me into the whole reflux world and getting certified in infant reflux, which then led me into, okay, reflux could be related to latch issues. It could be related to body tightness. So I've also done a lot of training in infant craniosacral therapy and tongue ties. And I've just been on this weaving path of learning all sorts of things about babies, which all impact sleep, which all impact each other. And so I really do view myself as sort of like a holistic baby guru. That's my Instagram handle, because I do have so many areas of expertise, I guess, that I support parents with. So when I support parents, I often get the parents who are like, we've tried so many other things and nothing has worked. Please help us. But I love it. It's fun. And I generally do look at the big picture. So I am able to kind of suss out what is the root cause here? Like, what is actually going on that's causing, quote unquote, poor sleep, or those frequent wakes, or that fussy baby, or difficulties with feeding or reflux,
Mhm.
to really start to suss out, like, why is that happening. And this is such a big, I love that we're talking about reflux today, because I feel like it's such a big misconception out there that reflux is like normal and it's fine and all babies get it, and like, just wait it out and your baby will be fine in a few months. And you're like, no, that's not fine.
Yes, it's such a big challenge for families. And yeah, I think that most people in the baby world do end up getting so much training because everything is linked, right? You're like, sleep's related to discomfort, it's related to feeding
Mhm.
and digestion and all the
Yeah,
things, right? So
all the
yeah,
things,
we're all
exactly.
tempted to like get trained in every single
I know.
aspect.
I know.
And
And
I
I'm definitely a course junkie. So like, I love learning, and I'm
yeah,
always like, oh, what else can I learn?
for sure. Me too. Me too. I always have to remind myself though to be like, you have a
A
great
lot.
I'm like, oh, I really want to be an IBCLC. And
I know.
like
I know.
we can refer sometimes too, but it's so great to have all of your expertise. It's
Mhm.
incredible. Um, and I think reflux is so common, but is it normal is the question. Um,
Exactly. It's
so many
common, but it's not normal. And that is one of those things that I feel like pediatricians and doctors, they just kind of like sweep it under the rug, and they're like, oh, like, this happens to all babies. Like, over 50% of my caseload has reflux. It's totally fine. But
yes.
it's not normal.
Yes. So tell us why does reflux happen? What is it? I
Sure.
guess for
Yeah, so
people who
let's talk
may
about reflux a little bit, because some types of reflux, so reflux really just means like involuntary regurgitation, and some types of reflux can be quote unquote normal, because yes, our babies are little, they're tiny, right? Their stomachs are smaller, their esophaguses are shorter, they don't have the same muscle development, right? So like,
not.
they have weaker muscles, and so all of that stuff can sort of lead to some of this spit up. They also don't have, mature digestive systems. And so some of this spit up can happen because of this quote unquote lack of development, and also just gravity, right? Like, they're more horizontal than vertical. And
Yeah.
so just gravity wise, like, yeah, we're going to get some spit up. And sometimes it is just that little bit of extra volume of milk that it was too much for their stomach to handle. And now it's coming back up.
Mhm.
But with those babies, usually that spit up, first of all, maybe isn't happening at every feed, or it's not happening frequently
Yeah.
after the feed,
Yeah.
like multiple spit ups after a feed, or the volume is smaller. But also, the big key difference is that it's happening without any pain or discomfort or crying, or just visible signs of kind of distress, right? And then it's like the happy spitters.
Yeah.
But we have to be careful even with those happy spitters, because if they're spitting up a lot, like frequently after that feed, and it's like projectile vomiting or things like that, they could still be very happy because we
Right.
have some easygoing unicorn babies out there. They do exist. And sometimes these babies really are happy. That was totally my first happy spitter, but didn't sleep really well,
Mhm.
didn't like tummy time. There were so many
Right.
factors. And now I found out just like, 7 years later that actually he had a tongue tie and wasn't really latching well. And that's why he had the reflux as a baby. But
Yeah.
he was a quote unquote happy spitter. Um, and so there's that piece where like that's considered reflux. But then the other side of the coin is what's called GERD. So
Yeah.
regular kind of reflux is GER, which is just gastroesophageal reflux. It just kind of describes what's happening. So gastro is the stomach, esophageal is the esophagus, and reflux is that regurgitation. GERD is when it's gastroesophageal reflux disorder or disease. And what that means is that we're having way more quote unquote episodes, I guess, of this reflux. So, like, instead of just like having a little bit of spit up like once after the feed, maybe they're having it 5 times after that feed, right? Or they're projectile vomiting, or they're spitting up and they're crying and they're just in so much pain or discomfort or just crying all the time, right?
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit later about colic because sometimes that's like this overarching term of like, oh, your baby's crying, we don't really know why. Whereas a lot of the reasons for reflux could actually also be the reasons for colic.
Because some of it could be like silent reflux, right? Where they're not
Exactly.
really.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so usually with this gastroesophageal reflux, there's more frequency. Often there's projectile vomiting involved, but really it's that pain, that discomfort, that fussiness. Like you can just tell your baby there's something going on and follow that gut instinct for sure.
Yeah.
Even if your doctor says it's normal,
Yeah.
please keep looking for the answer. If you get nothing else out of
Well,
this
or if
talk,
your doctor gives you a prescription.
okay, and we'll talk about
Right?
that because that
Yeah.
drives me crazy how many babies are on reflux medications.
Yeah. Exactly.
um, but yeah, so it's really that like pain, discomfort, fussiness, like frequency, really increased amount of spit up.
Yeah.
And so that's where we really want to be intervening. The other sort of happy spitters, there's probably still a reason. Some of that might be that overfilling of the belly. Some of that might be the, gravity and the lack of development. But also, we'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons behind reflux and why that might be happening. And so it's always really good to just be aware of these so you can start to rule them out.
Yeah.
So let's just quickly touch on the silent reflex piece because that's also really important to know because that really is when babies are having reflux, but it's not being vomited out, right? So sometimes it comes out of the nose or sometimes it just comes up and they swallow it back down. And that's almost worse because that can cause irritation and inflammation in the esophagus, in
Yeah.
the throat, right? And so, because that acid, that stomach acid, which is also another misconception where we're giving babies, not we, but like our medical system is giving babies gastric acid, like suppression medication, basically reflux medication to suppress the stomach acid. But actually, the stomach acid in babies, especially breastfed babies, is not the same as the stomach acid in adults. And
Interesting.
so it's not actually the same thing as what is happening for adults in terms of that acid reflux.
Mm.
It's not the same, but can still be inflammatory and really irritating if it's coming up and down, up and down, up and down.
Right.
And so those babies are those babies that, they have like that really soury kind of smell, or you can see that they're just constantly like swallowing because
Yeah.
it's coming up and coming down. They also usually are a little bit more fussy and irritable because they're in pain and discomfort. They might actually want to be latching all the time or drinking all the time because initially that liquid going down their throat and into the esophagus is kind of soothing, but then it just kind of exacerbates the issue, right?
Ah.
So there's so many things going on with that, but silent reflux is definitely one to always just be in the back of your mind. So even if your baby is not vomiting or spitting up, it might still be reflux.
Yeah. If they're really uncomfortable crying,
Mhm.
you can see it.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things doctors tell a lot of the families I work with is that the baby's epiglottis hasn't, like basically the flap that keeps
Mhm.
the esophagus shut, that hasn't developed, that it's just like wait for it to grow.
Well, and it's like, it's not that that hasn't developed, but the
Yeah.
muscle tone isn't quite there. It's not like the strength of it potentially isn't quite there.
Right.
But also sometimes if we have other things going on oromotor wise, then things are not working the way they should. And that epiglottis is not closing the way that it should, right? So this is why we always have to just be like aware of some of these causes, other causes of reflux. It's not just because your baby is little and doesn't have muscle development,
Right.
right?
And if
Like there's
that's
something
true,
else going
you
on.
can be supporting it, right?
Right.
There's other ways to
And
support.
and if it was, let's say, the epiglottis that wasn't closing, that reflux medication is doing absolutely nothing.
I've also heard, like, for adults who have acid reflux, actually, and this may be just one person's theory, that it's actually they have low stomach acid. So
Mhm.
actually, one way to help is to like have apple cider vinegar and things like that, and that
Yeah.
helps versus like this medication that's like lowering it when it's maybe already too low.
Oh, there's so many issues with reflux medication too. And most of the reflux medication is meant for adults. And the manufacturers actually say do not give to babies under 1 year. There's probably a reason for that.
And then, but there's so much, and all the parents, right? Maybe people watching are like, that was the only option for me. Like, what
And
do we do,
sometimes the
right?
reflux medication, so we'll talk about the medication now and then we'll go back to some of the causes because I think that's a really important piece of this talk also. But so sometimes the reflux medication is needed in the short term.
Right.
When it is helpful is especially for those babies that have a lot of that swallowing up and down. So that silent reflux, right? Or if they're having lots of episodes of that reflux where it's just really irritating the esophagus and the throat, right? So we really, in that case, the reflux medication is a temporary Band-Aid solution.
Yeah.
Temporary is the key word here because the amount of babies I have seen and supported who have been on reflux medication for months is mind-blowing.
Right.
Or they're on reflux medication and there's absolutely no plan to be weaning them off. They're just like, well, eventually when your baby is walking, they won't have reflux anymore and we can get them
Right.
off the medication. But that is so detrimental because first of all, there's all sorts of different not contraindications, but like consequences, side effects to reflux medications, like things like constipation and digestive difficulties and sleeping difficulties, insomnia, like all these things, right? So we have to take that into consideration. But also when we're changing the stomach acid, which is what those medications are doing, when we're changing the stomach acid in our body, we're also changing our digestive system. And we're also changing our stomach's ability to digest breast milk or formula or solids or whatnot. And that can also then lead to food sitting in the belly fermenting because it's not getting digested properly. The byproduct of fermentation is gas.
Right.
And when we have a lot of gas and air mixed in with our milk in this tiny little belly, eventually it becomes a pressurized container and it has to come out somehow. So you potentially could still be having the reflux anyway.
Vicious cycle. Yeah.
But also, if we're on this reflux medication for a long time and our digestive system now, like our enzymes have all kind of changed, they're not working the way that nature kind of intended, then we can also be having reactions to foods that we might not have had reactions to before because our system is just not working as efficiently as it should because we've been on this reflux medication for so long.
Right.
And so sometimes we can have lots of food sensitivities or even allergies as a result of being on medication for so long.
Makes sense. That makes sense.
So it's really it's a vicious cycle. And this is why, yes, in some cases, the reflux medication is helpful to reduce that pain, that inflammation, that irritation. However, at the same time that you are giving your baby that reflux medication, you should also be figuring out what the cause of the reflux is. And
Yes.
resolving that cause will help the reflux, which will then help you get off the medication, which will then help to decrease the amount of sort of side effects of that medication, right? That's the goal. We
Yeah.
should not have this goal of being on reflux medication just to, for like months and months. It really should be like, okay, how quickly can we get off of this? How quickly do we need or how much time do we need to figure out the root cause so that we can get off this medication?
Right.
That's the big piece that the medical system is not getting.
Yeah. So parents are kind of needing to find someone like you, someone is trained in
Mhm.
really finding the root causes. So will you
Yeah.
outline those for us? What causes this and what are the treatments for these causes?
Yeah, so let's chat about the first like big main cause, and this is always the one that I say to like rule out first, right? Because it's usually the easiest to kind of rule out and also to fix.
Mhm.
And that is aerophagia or air intake. Sometimes you may have heard of like the acronym AIR, air induced reflux. And that's exactly what it is. It just means drinking or swallowing of air. That's what aerophagia means. And so again, back to that idea of that gas and that air in the tummy adding with the milk or the formula, and it's causing that pressurized container, right? So then we have to figure out, why is that air coming in? And that could be because of poor latch. So really looking at like your baby's positioning while they're feeding. It could be because of, tongue function and tongue mobility. And is your baby able to move their tongue up and cup the tongue around the nipple? So that could potentially be because of like a tongue tie, or even a lip tie, which could affect the latch.
Yeah.
Is your baby able to suck properly? And one way to check that is put your finger in their mouth. Do
Right.
they kind of like have this disorganized thing where they're like trying to figure out how to suck? Like you'll know if your baby is sucking your finger or not. Or are they like trying to chomp?
Yeah.
Ideally, we want that like if this is the nipple and this is the tongue, we want that tongue cupping around the nipple of the breast or the bottle. We're pushing that tongue up to the palate, the roof of the mouth, and we're doing this kind of like wave-like motion, which is then helping to suck this milk out. But if your tongue, first of all, is not able to cup, if your tongue is not able to come up far enough under the nipple, it's not able to cup, it's not able to push that tongue up to the palate to create that kind of vacuum,
Yeah.
and that to extract the milk properly, then you're going to have that baby who's like chomping and like trying to like figure out, how do I get this milk out? And they might be able to get that milk out if you have a fast letdown, if you have an abundant supply of milk, if you're bottle feeding and that milk is just pouring out anyway, and all they have to do is just compress that bottle nipple a little bit to get that milk.
Yeah.
But they're also getting a lot of air in that way as well.
Yeah.
And that air then is causing that pressurized container in the stomach, and that's causing the reflux. And that also, so that pressure has to come out either out the front or out the back. So it's either the reflux or the explosive poop.
Both gotta be on.
Right?
So I think then if parents would be looking for like clicking and,
Exactly.
while eating and
So there's lots of different things. So the clicking is a big indicator, and often that's an indicator actually that that tongue is just kind of like not quite figuring out what to do. So that's usually an indicator that also I would get a tongue tie checked.
Yeah.
Or like oral motor function checked. But even things like milk bubbles, milk dribbling down the sides, you can often see if you're actually watching your baby latch, you can see like, does their lip curl under? Does their, lip kind of come off the nipple? Are they bobbing on and off? You can kind of see like, oh yeah, I see like this corner of their mouth is just open, right? They're not latching deeply enough. There's all sorts of different symptoms.
Yeah. So
And that's one of the easy ways to kind of check off.
Yeah.
The other symptom that I often hear a lot of, right? And then parents are told, oh, that's normal too, is if your baby is very sleepy during feeds or falls asleep very quickly after the feed has started, and or feeds better when they are half asleep, this is a sign that there's something going on with that latch or with that tongue function. And it's either too tiring and too exhausting for baby, so they're falling asleep shortly after latching because it's just too much work.
Yeah.
If they feed better when they're half asleep, what's happening there is actually their unconscious kind of brain is taking over, and that sucking reflex is coming into play. Versus when they're awake and they have to voluntarily do that sucking. So that's a key indication. If they don't do well at the breast or bottle when they're awake, but they do better when they're half asleep, then there's something going on there with the tongue function, with how their latch is happening. So those are all kind of different things to look out for.
That's really helpful.
Weak suck, that chomping suck, all of those are really keys, and you can test all of those at home.
Right.
Also the other indication that there's something going on with the tongue is like if they have like a lot of that like white kind of like leftover milk almost on their tongue a lot. That
Yeah.
means they're not clearing their tongue, which means their tongue is not getting up to the palate to clear the tongue as they swallow. So there's something going on there too. But also on mom's side, like the bleeding nipples, the like really sore nipples, like all of that, that's a lot of that chomping and biting on the breast to like figure out how to get this milk out because my tongue is not working properly, or my cheeks or my lips. Like there's something that's not going well.
Yeah. I always want parents to have ideally like an IBCLC,
Mhm,
someone come no matter
100%.
what within the
Yeah.
first few days of feeding,
Yeah.
because I think some people will be able to see the signs, other
Yeah.
people it's hard, especially if it's your first baby. So
Exactly.
even if you think feeding's going well, like as,
I
as
mean,
a doula, I have that in part as my package is that a
yeah.
Asian person's coming to your house, whether you're breastfeeding, bottle feeding,
Amazing.
whatever, just to even tell you you're just doing a good job. That's like
Yeah.
the minimum they're going to do, and that's helpful first.
So
And
good.
otherwise they can look for like all of this stuff too,
Yeah.
right? It should be
Yeah.
the
And
other
that's definitely, and this is why it takes a village, right? Like it really is like you need to have these different things because breastfeeding, especially, like it doesn't come naturally.
really hard.
I know that we all talk about like, oh yeah, it's like the biological norm and all of these things, but it's actually a lot harder generally. For some people it happens really easily, mom and baby click and everything's working well.
Yeah.
But for a majority of moms and babies, like we have to both learn, how do we do this? How do I
Totally.
hold the baby properly? How do I like latch them on? What does a good latch look like? And the baby's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, especially if there's anything like this going on, right? Because then they really
Yeah.
don't have that innate sense of like, okay, something's not working.
Yeah. We really need support to figure it
Hmm.
out.
Yeah.
Okay, we have 5 more minutes. What
Okay.
are the other like what are some other causes that people
So the next sort of major cause is digestive. And so that basically babies' digestive systems are immature, right? And so it may not be necessarily that they have a true food allergy, but maybe they have a sensitivity or an intolerance, or for whatever reason, their system is just not yet ready to digest that specific food.
Yeah.
And so what happens is often with these, you'll see like more of that projectile vomiting. You'll see again more of that kind of discomfort, that pain. But our bodies are so smart. Our bodies, our stomach is able to sense if there's something dangerous to our health, and it will get rid of it. If you've ever had food poisoning, like you know, right? And so this is something that you really want to be thinking of, but also with the digestive issues, you're gonna see more of the like the skin type issues, like the rashes, the eczema. You might see like those dark circles. There's other reasons for that too, but you might also like a lot of that like coughing or like constantly congested because your body is trying to make more mucus to protect itself. Um, Even things like really like swollen bellies, like the hard bellies, often those like constipation, obviously any kind of like blood or mucus or anything in the poo, like that's going to be your sort of symptoms that are showing like, okay, this might actually be digestive in nature.
And who would help with lactation? Professionals help parents with that too.
So potentially, I guess it would depend on their additional training. I don't know if that's like in just the normal like IBCLC training, but I do know that a lot of IBCLCs probably do additional like professional development in these areas of, food allergies, food intolerances. But a naturopath would be somebody to potentially chat with, and I know that there's some naturopath like IBCLCs, so like that would be something to kind of look at as well. But also just thinking about like, what are you, if you're breastfeeding, what are you eating? Like a lot of times babies and humans in general can't actually digest cow's milk dairy.
Yeah.
right? We're not designed to digest that because it's just different proteins. So our body doesn't have those same digestive enzymes. And so that is a big one, especially if there's a lot of like that constant congestion and that mucusy kind of thing, right? So even just looking at, all right, well, am I eating a lot of dairy? Or a lot of our formula has cow's milk in it. I'm not really
Yeah.
sure why,
Sure.
but but that's another piece, right? And so this is where sometimes it doesn't have to be a cow's milk protein allergy, but it could be a sensitivity because your digestive system is immature and it's not digesting that properly.
Yeah.
And so then you're having that undigested milk in the belly, which is causing the gas and the fermentation, or the body is like, "Ugh, get this out. I don't want this."
For sure. For
So
sure.
that's another big culprit. So those are two culprits. And then the third one is like physical tightness, like body tightness. And that's also very easy for babies to have if they've, been stuck under your ribs for a while in utero, or there was like lots of birth interventions, or they got stuck somehow, or they had to be pulled out with forceps, or, vacuum, or any of that stuff. Even C-section babies, often like if it's an emergency C-section, there was a reason baby didn't come. Like there's so many, right?
Yeah.
And so that kind of comes back to if you have this tight baby, for example, or they have like the torticollis or something is going on, then they're not going to be feeding as well.
Yeah.
So their latch is not going to be as well. So that's going to be affecting potentially the latch and the air intake, right? And they're just their overall comfort level. But also sometimes what can happen is we can get tight fascia on our body. And fascia is really just the like protective layer between the skin and the muscles, like very, very broad general terminology there. But fascia is all over our body. And if the fascia is tight, especially around the belly button, right? So if your baby had a short cord or the cord dropped around their neck, every time they moved in utero, that cord would pull. And so we have a lot of tightness in that stomach area, which can then also lead to discomfort and pain and crying and air intake and reflux as a result of that. So really getting some body work done, either like osteopath or craniosacral therapist, sometimes pediatric chiropractor as well, but I often recommend getting some of this, like either craniosacral or osteopathy first to release some of the fascia, and then do the chiropractic if there's any sort of spinal adjustments, because it will hold better.
That's great.
Right.
I had work done on myself recently. It was incredible.
Yeah, it's so good, right? So those
I
are
would
some
also wish that so many families access that as well.
I really think that it should be like every baby and every mom should get at least one session post-birth, 100%.
100%.
Yeah. And it should be covered.
And I usually find people that will go to the parents' home as well.
Yeah.
So they don't have to leave their house in those first few days. There's so many people who will do that as well.
Yeah.
There's so many so many reasons, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So those are sort of like the top 3 reasons. Of course, there's like other things that could be related to reflux as well. Like you could have like laryngomalacia, which just means that it's like that floppiness and that low tone in the larynx, right? Like all of these different, if you have a cow's milk protein allergy, like you're going to probably have more reflux, right? Like there's medical kind of conditions also that might lead to reflux as well. So like we don't have as much control over those, and those usually you would be like your medical team would be figuring that out pretty soon after birth. But even if your baby has a medical condition that is leading them to have more reflux or have reflux more easily, taking care of these other factors like the air intake and the digestive piece can often really reduce the symptoms. Even if you don't get rid of the reflux totally, it can really reduce the symptoms and potentially prevent your baby needing to have that medication, which is ultimately also what we're trying to do, right?
Sure. Yeah, I think the take-home message is if you see these things, just get support. Don't, I mean, it's hard because obviously we have to pay for support, but it is kind of for the reality, right? We do need to have some budget and hopefully save some money for this postpartum care, and contacting people like you or others who are really knowledgeable can just make such a big difference, right?
This is the stuff you should be adding on your baby registry.
Yes.
Right? Like Who cares about the bumbo seat? Please don't get the bumbo seat.
Exactly.
Or
Just
the baby
get a
swing
slush
even.
fund for
Spend
like
that money on
all the
support.
baby care, the care for the parents, like all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to show everybody your amazing book I have here. I'm going to keep diving into it. It's so cool. People can check it out. And where else can they find your information?
Yeah, so my Instagram is just the Holistic Baby Guru. Currently, my website is www.kylieetz.com. As I mentioned, I offer pediatric services or OT services in Ontario in Canada. I do that virtually and in person if you're in my area. But I also offer sleep and reflux support, development support as a non-OT for worldwide. Just virtually, obviously, and through my online courses. So I do have like lots of online courses, but really my book is going to be the easiest way for people to get all of my knowledge rolled into one little package. The cheapest way to work with me is actually going to be through my book.
Yeah.
And it is meant to be like a reference book. So like I do have parents who have read it cover to cover, but that's not necessarily how I intended. It will flow cover to cover, but the intention is that you're like, oh, I have issues with reflux. Let me go to the reflux chapter. Oh, I have issues with sleep. Let me go to the sleep chapter. Oh, I'm wondering, I heard something about sensory processing. Let me go to the sensory processing chapter and learn a little bit more about that.
Great. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me. This was super fun. And I would love to give away a copy of my book. So we'll have to figure out like some details about that giveaway.
Yeah, absolutely.
But like, I don't know, maybe we'll just choose somebody randomly who is commenting on this video, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah. Comment on the video.
And then I can get in touch with them and I will send them a signed copy of my book.
Love it. Love it. Yeah. Comment on the video. We'll do a lottery and pick someone from.
Yeah, very exciting. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks so much. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Okay. Second.